I can't believe this is happening today. I whispered to myself as I stared at the blinking notification on my phone, the words on the screen feeling heavier than any eulogy I could have imagined. The sun barely crested the horizon, casting a muted glow across the empty living room where James's laughter used to echo. And yet here I was, alone, confronted with numbers and alerts that made my chest tighten. The morning air drifted through the slightly open window, carrying with it the faint scent of dew and freshly cut grass, reminding me that life outside the walls continued, unaware of the storm brewing in my heart. I sat at the edge of the worn oak dining table, hands wrapped around a mug of untouched coffee, the steam rising in spirals that seemed almost accusatory, as though it could burn away the confusion and disbelief swirling inside me. Margaret, that's what I called myself today. Margaret, widow of James, mother of David, and somehow, despite all the years of care and quiet sacrifices, completely unprepared for the revelation this alert contained. My fingers hovered over the screen again, hesitating, tracing the bold letters of the bank name and the amount highlighted in green, an amount that should have never been there, or perhaps should have arrived differently, accompanied by explanations I had never received. I felt the weight of the past weeks, the sleepless nights sorting through James's affairs, the phone calls with distant relatives who spoke in hushed tones, the quiet nods from neighbors that never turned into offers of help. All of it collided with the digital reality that blinked at me now, impersonal yet intimate, a stark reminder that the world could be indifferent, even in moments of profound grief. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, a reminder that life moved on mechanically while my own world had been upended in the span of a single notification. Outside, a robin perched on the fence post, tilting its head as though questioning my very existence, a small yet piercing contrast to the chaos that had just entered my morning. I remembered James's hand on mine the night before his hospital stay, warm and reassuring, a touch that carried the promise of safety, a promise now irrevocably broken, leaving only the cold reality of numbers and alerts. I took a deep breath, letting it fill my lungs and shake through my shoulders, grounding myself in the familiar rhythm of my own heartbeat, and then I rose slowly, moving to the window to look at the street below, noticing the neighbor's dog wagging its tail, completely unaware of the emotional hurricane inside the house. Each detail was sharp, a contrast between ordinary life and the extraordinary betrayal I felt creeping through the very fabric of what I thought was my family. The alert had arrived at the exact moment I expected to find solace among grieving faces, to share stories and tears, to place a flower on James's coffin and feel connected to the man I had spent decades with. Yet instead, I was met with digits and a message, sterile and unyielding, demanding comprehension I was not ready to grant. Margaret, I reminded myself, had always been patient, had always measured her words and deeds, keeping calm in storms both literal and metaphorical, and now that patience would be tested in ways I had only theorized about in quiet moments of reflection. The digital glow from my phone reflected in my blue eyes, dulled by shock, yet sharpening my focus in an unexpected way, bringing clarity to the patterns of oversight, negligence, and subtle manipulations that had long gone unnoticed. Each breath I took was deliberate, each pause calculated, as if my body was preparing to witness and navigate a labyrinth of deceit that had been hiding in plain sight. I could feel the tension coiling in my chest, a taut line connecting grief and anger, past and present, and I knew that the day, which had begun with mourning and ritual, had now transformed into a battlefield of wit, composure, and revelation. My hands finally moved, lifting the phone and scrolling through the alert once more, each transaction, each timestamp, each number an unspoken story of choices made without my knowledge, a betrayal that required both understanding and action. The scent of brewed coffee mixed with the faint aroma of morning dew seeping through the curtains, grounding me while the storm inside demanded attention. And so, in that quiet morning, on the cusp of James's farewell, I made a silent vow to observe, to understand, and to reclaim the control that had been subtly stripped away, knowing that nothing in this day would proceed as I had once imagined, that every detail would matter, and that Margaret, widow and witness, would navigate this unexpected twist with the calm and precision that had always been her way. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, with only the faint ticking of the antique clock on the mantel breaking the stillness. Margaret moved slowly through the rooms, her footsteps softened by the thick carpet, her eyes catching the small details that had always brought comfort, yet now felt hollow. She noticed the photograph of James on the side table, his smile gentle, familiar, a memory that seemed almost cruel in its warmth given the revelations of the morning. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains, highlighting dust motes dancing lazily in the air, and she felt the emptiness of the space more keenly than ever. She walked into the kitchen, set a kettle on the stove, and listened to the hiss of water heating, focusing on the mundane rhythm of everyday life to steady her mind. Each small task, placing the cups in a row, arranging the sugar and cream, seemed both a connection to normalcy and a reminder of what had been disrupted. The dining table, polished and ready for breakfast that would never come, bore the imprint of years of care, yet it now felt like a stage for observation rather than a place of gathering. Margaret paused by the window, looking out at the familiar street where neighbors were beginning their morning routines, unaware of the silent turmoil within her home. She traced the outlines of the garden where James had planted roses and lavender, now in full bloom, a symbol of beauty and life continuing in contrast to the uncertainty of her own day. Her mind revisited the subtle signs she had ignored, the small inconsistencies, the brief glances between David and Sophia, the hurried excuses for missed calls or mismanaged household matters. Each recollection layered, with unease, forming a pattern she could no longer dismiss. She sipped from her cup, the warmth grounding her, and allowed herself to notice the tension coiled beneath her ribs, not yet acted upon but acknowledged. The air in the house carried the scent of freshly baked bread from the previous evening, mingling with the faint aroma of coffee, comforting yet bittersweet, tethering her to routines she had upheld for decades. Margaret moved to the living room, smoothing the cushions on the sofa where she and James had spent countless evenings, her hand lingering on the fabric as though absorbing memories and strength simultaneously. The silence was interrupted only by the soft chirping of birds outside, their indifferent song a reminder that the world had not paused for her grief or the shock of discovery. She reflected on the conversations that had taken place in this very room, on the laughter and plans shared, and contrasted them with the hidden currents she had now begun to perceive, subtle manipulations and omissions that had accumulated unnoticed. Margaret allowed herself a slow, measured breath, acknowledging the tension and the grief, but also the clarity that had begun to surface, a quiet determination that steadied her steps and sharpened her awareness. Each movement through the home was deliberate, a combination of routine and reconnaissance, a silent mapping of both the environment and the emotional terrain she needed to navigate. She paused again at the window, watching the morning unfold, noting the small but telling gestures of neighbors, the delivery truck rumbling past, the newspaper landing at the doorstep, all ordinary, yet for her imbued with a sense of contrast between external normalcy and internal upheaval. Margaret's thoughts turned inward, considering what steps might be necessary, the careful observations she would need to make before acting, the patience required to understand fully the scope of what had occurred. She set the cup down, wiped her hands on a tea towel, and straightened, feeling the weight of her own resolve settling around her like a mantle. The day stretched ahead, full of both routine and revelations, and she moved with measured intent, aware that each moment would demand both vigilance and composure, that the quiet of the house was a canvas upon which the next chapter of discovery and response would be painted, and that she alone would control the rhythm of this unfolding narrative. Margaret moved through the hallways with a careful steadiness, her eyes catching the sunlight filtering through the windows and tracing the patterns it made on the hardwood floors. She paused at the family photo wall, where images of birthdays, vacations, and quiet evenings spent with James and David reminded her of the life she had meticulously built. Each photograph carried warmth, yet also a subtle ache, a reminder of how easily appearances could conceal underlying truths. She lingered on a picture of James reading to David by the fireplace, the firelight dancing across their faces, and she felt a pang of loss that was both personal and strategic, a recognition that the comfort she had known could now be leveraged into understanding the gaps in what she had been told. In the kitchen, Margaret moved to the small writing desk tucked into the corner, brushing her fingers over the polished surface, recalling how she had once kept meticulous records of household expenses, gifts, and appointments, a habit born of love and diligence. Today, that habit became a tool, a lens through which she could assess what had transpired, noting small inconsistencies in past transactions and communications that previously had seemed insignificant. She opened her laptop, the soft hum of the machine filling the quiet room, and began to cross-reference statements and messages, eyes narrowing as patterns emerged, subtle yet unmistakable. There were delays, unexplained changes, moments when communication had been diverted or ignored, all small pieces of a puzzle that now formed a coherent image of oversight and misdirection. Margaret paused to take a sip from her teacup, the warmth providing a measure of comfort and clarity as she leaned back in her chair, allowing herself a moment to process both grief and realization. She traced the outline of the window frame, noting how the light shifted as clouds passed overhead, each movement echoing the passage of time and the necessity of careful observation. A gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming hydrangeas from the garden, reminding her of the life that continued outside, indifferent to her inner calculations, and yet it also grounded her, keeping her presence anchored in the moment. She reviewed her notes again, highlighting transactions and conversations that had previously been overlooked, each mark a step toward understanding, toward reclaiming awareness and authority in a situation that had begun to feel beyond her control. The phone lay silent beside the laptop, a tool waiting for the right moment, its screen dark, yet full of potential communication and confrontation when the time was right. Margaret allowed herself to notice the smallest details, from the angle of the sun on the countertop to the slight creak of the floorboards under her weight, each a reminder of the environment she had curated and maintained with care. She moved through the rooms again, noting the arrangement of furniture, the placement of chairs and tables, and how each element of the home could serve as both comfort and reference point in her ongoing assessment. Every glance, every movement, was deliberate, building a silent narrative that would guide her next steps. The quiet of the house, punctuated only by distant sounds from the street and the occasional rustle of leaves outside, created a space for reflection and strategic thought. Margaret settled into a chair by the window, the sunlight now warmer on her face, and she allowed her mind to connect the dots, weaving together observations, memories, and instincts. The realization of how things had been mismanaged and manipulated emerged clearly, yet she maintained calm, focusing on what could be understood, what could be anticipated, and what could be acted upon with measured precision. The morning had begun with shock and continued with silent observation, and Margaret knew that by remaining composed, attentive, and deliberate, she would navigate the unfolding complexities with insight and control, turning a day that began with loss into an opportunity to reclaim clarity and agency within her own life. Margaret sank into the chair by the bay window, the sunlight falling in gentle streaks across her face, illuminating the fine lines that had formed over decades of careful observation and measured patience. She allowed her mind to drift back to quieter times, recalling how James had always been the anchor, the steady presence in a world of small unpredictabilities. The living room seemed to carry the weight of memory, the air heavy with the faint scent of his cologne that lingered on the upholstery, a reminder of moments both tender and ordinary. She traced her gaze over the bookshelf where James's favorite novels stood, their spines worn and familiar, and the coffee table where they had shared countless cups of tea and whispered conversations about plans, hopes, and the future of their family. Each object, each photograph, each note or token from the past seemed imbued with both warmth and a subtle sting, a reminder that the ordinary routines of life were also the threads that wove their shared story together. Margaret reflected on the years of planning, the careful attention to birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet celebrations that often went unnoticed but had built the foundation of family life, now thrown into contrast with the quiet inconsistencies and evasions she had begun to detect. Her hand rested on the arm of the chair as she imagined the sequence of events leading to the alert, the small decisions and omissions that had culminated in this moment of revelation. Each recollection sharpened her awareness of patterns she had once overlooked, subtle shifts in David's demeanor, the measured politeness of Sophia, the moments when explanations had been vague, when messages had been delayed, and when questions about household arrangements were met with vague assurances rather than clear answers. Margaret considered how these small actions, when placed together, formed a lattice of intent and oversight, and she felt a calm determination settle in her chest. She rose and walked slowly through the hallway, her footsteps quiet on the polished wood, noting the doors to the rooms where David had grown up, where friends had gathered, and where family celebrations had been held. Each threshold represented not just space, but memory, a living record of the life she had nurtured, maintained, and now quietly reassessing with a discerning eye. The sunlight shifted as she moved, creating soft patterns that marked the passage of time and emphasized the stillness, the silence, the weight of reflection. Margaret paused at the mirror in the hallway, meeting her own gaze, seeing a woman shaped by love, loss, and now insight, a woman capable of navigating the delicate balance between grief and awareness. She continued her observation, noting the arrangement of flowers on the side table, the placement of cushions on the sofa, the subtle differences in the way light and shadow played across the room, all elements that might have been taken for granted but now offered context and clarity. The house itself seemed to breathe with her, responsive to the rhythm of her thoughts, a partner in the quiet investigation of what had transpired and what might be anticipated. Margaret allowed herself to sit again, hands folded in her lap, breathing steadily, letting the quiet guide her understanding of both the present and the past, preparing herself mentally for the careful and measured steps she would take as she continued to untangle the threads of oversight, intent, and family dynamics that had come to light in the most ordinary yet revealing moments of the morning. Margaret moved to the study, her fingers brushing lightly over the edges of the papers neatly stacked on the desk, each one a relic of careful planning, receipts, and correspondence she had kept over the years. She opened the drawers, scanning the contents with an attentive eye, noting every envelope, every note, every detail that might offer a clue or confirm a suspicion she had nurtured since the bank alert. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust particles that floated lazily in the air, creating a sense of time suspended, where every sound and shadow became a marker for observation. She unfolded a letter from the previous month, noting the handwriting, the postmark, and the tone, examining it as though it were a puzzle piece to be fitted into a larger picture. The quiet of the house enveloped her, amplifying the subtle creaks and groans of the floors, each a reminder of the life that had been lived here, the routines that had once been comforting and now served as reference points for her scrutiny. Margaret paused to breathe deeply, letting the aroma of brewed coffee from the kitchen mix with the faint scent of old books and polished wood, grounding her in a calm awareness that contrasted with the tension simmering beneath the surface of her thoughts. She reviewed her notes, cross-referencing dates, amounts, and communications, tracing the path of interactions that had seemed innocent at first glance, but now appeared calculated, deliberate, and subtly manipulative. The study, with its lined bookshelves and framed photographs of family milestones, felt like a vantage point, a place from which she could quietly survey the extent of what had been done without her knowledge. Margaret allowed herself to recall moments of trust, small gestures of care, and the way she had consistently been present for her family, and she measured them against the discoveries she was making now, noting the dissonance between intention and outcome. Her eyes lingered on a framed photograph of James smiling, holding David as a boy, and she felt a resolve harden, a determination that clarity and calm observation would guide her next steps. The ticking of the clock on the wall marked the passage of minutes, yet she moved deliberately, unhurried, letting the analysis unfold at its own pace, weighing each fact and inflection carefully. Margaret's gaze shifted to the window overlooking the garden, noting the pattern of light on the hedges and the gentle sway of the flowers in the morning breeze, a serene backdrop to the careful mental mapping she was performing. Each observation, each connection she made between documents and recollections, strengthened her understanding of the situation, and she allowed herself the patience to sit with it, unbroken by frustration or haste. The subtle sounds of the neighborhood outside, The distant bark of a dog, the faint hum of traffic, a neighbor opening a door, reminded her that life continued beyond her walls. Yet within the house she had cultivated, she held a quiet dominion, aware of every detail, every nuance, every clue that might lead to a fuller picture of the intentions and oversights that had brought her to this moment. Margaret rose from the chair, stretching slightly, her movements precise, purposeful, as she turned to the desk once more, ready to continue her careful investigation, knowing that the accumulation of evidence, observation, and reflection would guide her to the next moment of understanding and strategic response. Margaret settled back into the armchair by the window, the morning light shifting as clouds moved across the sky, casting soft shadows that played across the floorboards and furniture. She allowed herself a moment of quiet observation, noting the subtle creases in the carpet, the faint scratches on the wooden table, the gentle sway of the curtains in the breeze, all of which had previously gone unnoticed, yet now seemed significant in their ordinariness. Her mind traced the timeline of recent events, each interaction and transaction analyzed with precision, layering one piece of understanding atop another until a clearer pattern emerged. Margaret thought of David, her son, and Sophia, his wife, and considered the small gestures, the slight hesitations in conversation, the moments when explanations felt overly formal or unusually careful. Each recollection reinforced her sense of deliberate intention, and she felt the calm awareness of her own insight settle into her chest, steady and measured. She opened a notebook she kept nearby, flipping to a blank page, and began to outline observations, cross-referencing them with details she had recorded over the past weeks, the dates of calls, emails, and financial statements, each entry a step toward a complete understanding of the situation. Outside, the neighborhood was coming alive with the usual morning activities, the distant hum of cars, the soft chatter of neighbors greeting one another, a rhythmic background that contrasted with the still, methodical pace within the house. Margaret traced the lines of the desk, the edge of the chair, the arrangement of the room, considering how each physical element related to the emotional and strategic landscape she was navigating. She reflected on the subtle ways she had maintained awareness over the years, habits of attention and care that had now become tools for assessment and planning. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint aroma of the morning air drifting through the slightly open window, providing both grounding and clarity. Margaret allowed her thoughts to move forward carefully, considering potential responses, weighing consequences, imagining scenarios with both restraint and precision, mindful of timing and context. She reviewed each note again, confirming details, identifying discrepancies, and ensuring that her understanding was comprehensive, each discovery reinforcing her confidence in the path she was preparing to take. The study was silent except for the ticking of the clock and the soft rustle of papers as she adjusted them, creating a deliberate rhythm that mirrored the careful unfolding of her strategy. Margaret stood, stretching lightly, feeling the steady beat of her own resolve, and walked slowly to the kitchen to pour herself another cup of tea, each movement deliberate, each breath measured, reinforcing a calm but vigilant awareness of the world inside and outside the house. The quiet of the morning, the steady light, and the familiar objects surrounding her provided a sense of continuity and control, a framework within which Margaret could navigate the complexities she had uncovered. She took her tea back to the window, sipping slowly, letting the warmth settle into her, a contrast to the precise attention of her mind. Every detail mattered, every observation counted, and Margaret allowed herself to focus completely on the unfolding picture, knowing that patience, awareness, and deliberate thought would guide her through the moments to come, ensuring that insight and strategy would determine the next steps in a day that had already begun with revelation and careful reflection. Margaret leaned back into the armchair, the morning light shifting subtly as clouds moved, creating fleeting patterns on the walls and floor that seemed to mirror the shifting clarity in her mind. She traced the contours of the room, noting how the sunlight fell across the bookshelves, highlighting the spines of familiar novels and the faint inscriptions James had once written in the margins, reminders of a life shared with care and intention. The gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional chirp of birds outside provided a quiet rhythm as she reviewed her notes again, cataloging every interaction, every financial record, and every subtle gesture that had hinted at hidden motives. Her eyes rested on the family photographs along the mantel, observing David and Sophia in moments of laughter and planning, and she measured them against the insights she had gleaned over the morning, aware of the discrepancies between appearances and reality. Each observation sharpened her understanding, allowing her to anticipate behaviors, to connect dots that had previously seemed isolated, and to see patterns of omission and redirection that had gone unnoticed. Margaret sipped her tea slowly, the warmth grounding her while her mind traced the chronology of events, reviewing emails, receipts, and casual conversations with an analytical calm that belied the emotional weight of the day. She considered the subtle way Sophia had navigated household matters, the polite yet evasive replies to inquiries, the delayed or incomplete responses to requests, and the moments when David's tone carried a weight of unease, all pieces forming a lattice of insight that now allowed Margaret to prepare for measured and deliberate action. Moving to the window, she looked out over the quiet street, noting the pattern of light across the hedges, the movement of neighbors attending to their morning routines, and the delivery truck rolling by, all mundane, yet forming a contrast to the intricate map of awareness she had begun to create within the house. Margaret's attention shifted to the kitchen counter where the bank statement lay, still unopened, a tangible representation of the situation she was navigating, and she allowed herself to imagine the steps needed to address the discrepancies while maintaining control and composure. Her fingers rested briefly on the envelope, and she closed her eyes, centering herself in the stillness, letting her understanding crystallize into strategy. Every movement, every glance, and every recollection was deliberate, forming a coherent approach to a day that had begun in quiet grief and would unfold under her measured observation and insight. She moved back to the study, brushing her hand along the desk, noting the alignment of papers and notes, the placement of the pen, the small details that reflected order and consistency, grounding her in the familiar routines even as she mapped the complexities of human behavior around her. The warmth of sunlight on her face, the scent of brewed coffee, and the muted sounds of morning life outside combined with the precision of her attention to create a focused space where Margaret could observe, plan, and prepare, ready to navigate the unfolding hours with patience, insight, and controlled presence. Margaret returned to the living room, her steps measured, each movement deliberate as she surveyed the familiar space with renewed awareness. The sunlight had shifted slightly, casting long, soft shadows across the floor, and she noticed how the light highlighted subtle imperfections in the furniture, edges worn by years of use, as though the room itself bore witness to the passage of time and the layers of memory embedded within it. She settled into the armchair, her gaze moving over the mantel, taking in the framed photographs that chronicled decades of family life, each image a reminder of moments that had seemed ordinary but now carried nuanced significance in light of recent observations. She reached for a notebook on the side table, flipping through pages filled with meticulous records and notes, scanning transactions, dates, and small interactions that had once seemed inconsequential but now revealed a coherent pattern of behavior and intent. The quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of morning activity outside provided a soft rhythm, a backdrop to the focused attention Margaret gave to each line of writing and each detail she recalled from conversations and encounters over the past months. Her fingers traced the edges of a photograph where James and David had shared a quiet moment. The expressions captured their highlighting trust, connection, and the ordinary gestures of care that formed the fabric of their family life. Margaret allowed herself a slow, steady breath, grounding her awareness in the present while connecting it with the clarity emerging from her observations. She considered the interactions she had witnessed between David and Sophia, the subtle hesitations in their speech, the carefully chosen words, and the deliberate timing of actions that had previously escaped notice. Each recollection added depth to the understanding she was constructing, reinforcing her insight into the dynamics that had gone unnoticed. Margaret took a sip of tea, the warmth settling into her, a contrast to the analytical clarity of her mind, providing both comfort and focus as she traced the chronology of events, reconciling dates and small inconsistencies into a clear narrative. The room seemed to respond to her calm scrutiny, each object and surface a reference point, each shadow and beam of light a subtle marker for reflection. She allowed her attention to drift to the small details, the placement of cushions, the alignment of books, the slight tilt of a frame on the wall, all seemingly mundane, yet offering context and insight when viewed through her careful observation. Margaret closed her notebook briefly, hands resting on her lap, and let the quiet of the house and the clarity of the morning guide her thoughts, reinforcing patience, deliberation, and the quiet authority she carried within her. The sunlight continued to shift, marking the passage of minutes and the unfolding of the day, and she remained poised, attentive to the nuances of environment and memory, ready to navigate the complexities of her family's actions with precision and quiet confidence, allowing understanding to accumulate before any response or decision was made, knowing that this deliberate awareness would guide her through the hours ahead. Margaret rose from the armchair, the sunlight now filtering more brightly through the windows, casting long, warm streaks across the room that seemed to illuminate both the physical space and the clarity forming in her mind. She moved toward the dining table, her hands gliding over the polished surface, noting the subtle details of the grain in the wood, the alignment of the silverware, and the placement of the napkins, each element reflecting a life of careful attention and deliberate action. The house was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock and the distant hum of morning traffic outside, a rhythm that contrasted with the intensity of her thoughts and the precise mental mapping she was conducting. Margaret's gaze fell upon the documents she had arranged earlier, the bank statements, letters, and notes that together told a story she had pieced together with patience and observation. Each page revealed small inconsistencies, omissions, and careful timing that indicated intentional concealment, and she considered them with both the calm of reflection and the determination of one who knew that understanding was power. She sat at the table, arranging the papers methodically, making connections between dates, transactions, and conversations, allowing her mind to see the full arc of the actions she had observed. Outside, the garden shimmered in the sunlight, the roses and hydrangeas swaying gently in the breeze, a serene counterpoint to the strategic focus Margaret maintained within the house. She allowed herself to breathe slowly, feeling the warmth of her tea in her hands, grounding her attention as she traced the sequence of events, reviewing each subtle gesture and word exchanged between David and Sophia over the past weeks. Each recollection brought clarity, a sense of coherence emerging from what had initially appeared as isolated moments, and Margaret acknowledged the power of observation, patience, and deliberate thought. She noted how the ordinary details, the tilt of a picture frame, the slight misalignment of a chair, the timing of calls and responses, had accumulated into an understanding that was both comprehensive and actionable. Margaret rose, moving to the window to look out at the quiet street, the sunlight reflecting on parked cars and the soft flutter of leaves, the world continuing its routine. Unaware of the meticulous work unfolding within her home, her mind considered the next steps with care, weighing timing, communication, and subtlety, knowing that the presentation of insight would be as important as the insight itself. She returned to the dining table, reviewing her notes once more, allowing herself to appreciate the depth of understanding she had achieved, the quiet power of knowledge cultivated through careful observation and deliberate reflection. The afternoon light shifted, casting longer shadows that mirrored the progression of her thoughts, and Margaret felt a calm resolve settle over her, a readiness to act when the moment was right, confident in her ability to navigate the delicate balance between patience, clarity, and influence. Each small gesture, each measured breath, reinforced her composure, allowing her to move forward with both awareness and intentionality, prepared to address the situation with the calm authority she had honed over a lifetime of experience and thoughtful observation.